Hi again, and welcome back to my series of talks on disability and welfare, based on my book, Class Citizens. We discussed last time how campaigning by disabled people and their families and charities had led to the creation of the first sickness and disability benefits in the 1970s. This was a good time for disabled people. They were beginning to be acknowledged by the state as equal citizens with equal rights. Social policy began to include sick and disabled people, welcoming them into the welfare state as created by Beveridge and the Labour government 20 years previously. Unfortunately, it was not a time of unmitigated good news. Instead, just as sick and disabled people began to be included in the welfare state itself began to be pulled back, counteracting the positive steps forward. Welfare policies since the 1970s have been increasingly predicated on three flawed assumptions: neoliberalism, which is basically that the government should step back from public services and investment and instead let markets have more freedom; welfare dependency, which is the belief that people are poor primarily because of poor life choices and not because of structural factors; and malingering, which is an extension of the welfare dependency myth into chronic illness, and holds that most people who say they are too sick to work are not, in fact, too sick to work. Today we are going to look at neoliberalism. The next two talks will look at welfare dependency and malingering. The early 1970s experienced a major oil crisis which dramatically altered the course of the UK and many Western and developing countries. When the major oil-producing countries decided in the early 1970s not to sell their oil to certain Western countries, the price of oil shot up. And because oil is used in pretty much everything, whether to burn it for energy or to incorporate it as a plastic into a huge range of goods, the prices of goods went up. Standard economic theory says that prices go up when people have more money, because they are spending more, they're demanding more. It's a booming economy where everyone is employed and enjoying wage increases. In such an economy, rising wages match the rising prices, so the net impact is zero. People can buy the same amount of goods and services as they could previously. But this time, prices weren't increasing because people had more money, but because the cost of production had gone up. Incomes hadn't increased in line with the increases in prices, so there was a negative effect. People couldn't afford to buy as many goods and services as before. Because people were buying less, businesses couldn't sell as much of their product or service as previously, so they had to produce less. When businesses aren't producing as much, they don't need as many employees, so they let employees go, which meant that these former employees now had even less money with which to buy products. So demand for produce dropped further. Employers produced less and let more people go, and so on. Normally, this would result in a drop in prices, as businesses lower their prices in a bid to get people to buy their products again. But this couldn't happen because the cost of production had gone up, so lowering prices would have meant selling at a loss rather than just selling at a lower profit. So we had high prices, high inflation, and high unemployment all at the same time, and the politicians panicked. For some reason, they didn't factor in the oil crisis as the reason why prices had gone up when demand hadn't gone up. They didn't consider that perhaps the same economic laws still applied, just at a different threshold because of the increase in oil costs. Instead, they listened to different voices, like Milton Friedman, who said that the problem was that we wanted to maintain full employment and hope that inflation stayed manageable. He said we should control inflation and hope that unemployment stayed manageable. Labour partially listened to this in the 1970s, and then Thatcher came in, turned the country firmly in the direction of neoliberal economics, and unemployment shot up from 1 million to 3 million. We've never recovered full employment since. Let that sink in for a moment. We were promised 40 years ago that if we controlled inflation, then the market would sort out employment in a short to medium time frame. It hasn't even come close to achieving what its proponents claimed, and instead it's caused huge costs to those people left unemployed by the economic policies of the government that's meant to ensure or provide opportunity for them. Neoliberal economics didn't just mean focusing on inflation and hoping that unemployment would fall. It also meant rolling back the welfare state that had caused what is now called the Golden Age. The new ideology said we should let the markets take control, because markets know better than government. It said we should cut social security, because people weren't unemployed due to the government no longer guaranteeing full employment, but because they weren't looking hard enough, or they didn't desire work strongly enough, despite the fact that up until recently they'd probably been in work. It said we didn't need society and the state, just individual people and the market. It ignored the fact that unemployment followed the government's economic strategy and wasn't due to some sudden mass delusion in people who previously had enjoyed full employment and lifelong careers, that unemployment was actually better than employment. What followed was decades of retrenchment, mitigated slightly during the Blair and Brown years, and reinvigorated with gusto by Cameron and Osborne. Ironically, Margaret Thatcher later argued that industry and trade are the basic social service because they provide a large number of jobs, and without a job there is no way of looking after one's family. Yet with the rejection of government's previous function of maintaining full employment, the governments of the 1970s and especially the 1980s cut this most basic of social services. As well as ending the general commitment to full employment, Thatcher's subsequent governments oversaw the loss of many manual industries and skilled trades which had previously been the life support of entire communities. The government claimed that it wanted industry and trade to thrive and to provide jobs for everyone, and then caused the exact opposite. They said people should have access to industry and trade rather than needing social security, a point pretty much everyone agrees on, and then removed that access and wondered why people suddenly needed social security. In the 1970s, we didn't have the data to confirm that neoliberalism is the wrong approach, but we do now. Neoliberalism argues that increased money to the top results in increased money to the bottom too. It's the idea that money trickles down, or that a rising tide lifts all boats, rather than drowning those whose anchor chains are too short. But now we know that when the income share of the top 20% increases, instead of that money trickling down, economic growth actually slows. If the income share of the bottom 20% increases, then economic growth speeds up. Increased inequality is also associated with reduced economic growth of the long term because of the increased recessions associated with inequality. It is increased money at the bottom, not at the top, that sustains and supports a strong economy. Increased money at the top, like any top-heavy arrangement, is deeply unstable and prone to collapse. Increased money at the bottom, like a house with a strong foundation, means an economy that can withstand earthquakes and storms and still grow and support those in the bottom deciles. Those who argue for austerity during a recession, or for small government generally, do so because they believe that any damage will be short-term or will simply not occur. They believe that governments that cut spending now can, and most likely will, cut tax in the future, and that low government spending and low taxation will result in substantially improved business spending and investment, because businesses like places that have low tax rates. They believe that government borrowing results in increased interest rates, which makes borrowing to invest more costly for businesses and so reduces their level of investment. For these two reasons, they believe that a small government that spends little and taxes little attracts private business and results in a strong economy. The evidence, however, is the opposite. For a start, when the problem a country faces is insufficient demand, the remedy isn't to reduce demand even further by reducing government spending. That just weakens the economy even more, making it even less attractive to private businesses. What businesses base their plans on is not so much the hope that a struggling economy will soon be a strong one, but on whether the economy is strong right now. Government austerity can only result in a strong economy if private businesses were then to create that strength themselves in the face of a weak government. It therefore relies upon circular behaviour, that businesses would invest on the basis that the economy will be strong, which would only happen as long as enough of them invest. But the cost if no one else invests or not enough people invest is high. So it's very risky for a business to invest into a weak economy. So businesses much prefer to invest into economies that are already strong. This is borne out clearly in the data, which shows that private business spending follows boom and bust cycles and perpetuates rather than corrects them. Private businesses don't rescue a country from either recession or from unstable rates of growth and asset bubbles. It is not austerity, but steady economic growth created, sustained and maintained by government spending that supports private investment in business. What is needed in a recession or economic difficulty like this time of COVID is not government cuts, but judicious government spending on welfare and productivity, such as social security, healthcare and infrastructure. Businesses like to invest in countries that are stable, where their private property is secure and safe from vandalism and theft, where the available workforce is well educated and a decent healthcare system means that workers are in good health, where there is good transport networks and reliable electricity and internet. It is the government that builds the roads, educates the children, treats the sick and maintains justice and peace. Governments that spend less on these have a weakened society, which is a less profitable and stable place into which to invest. Private businesses like stable, healthy and educated societies. Not only has the neoliberal approach not worked, we can see that other approaches in other countries have worked. Again and again and again, the countries with the biggest public sectors are the countries that rank at the top. Big government is correlated with better quality of government and more equality generally, and equality is correlated with better and more durable economic growth, and better figures on physical health, mental health, obesity, child well-being, teenage pregnancies, drug abuse, violence, imprisonment, education, social mobility, and trust in community life. These figures aren't just true for the poor, they're true for the rich as well. It is far better for your well-being to be rich in Scandinavia than ultra-rich in America or the UK. Unlike the 1970s and 80s, we no longer have the excuse of not knowing better. The result of austerity was that the UK experienced the worst recovery from recession on modern record. We caused substantial harm to our poorer citizens, including the working class and the sick and disabled, and we not only didn't have to, but we shouldn't have done so. All the evidence is that austerity and small government fails again and again. Other countries with stronger welfare and public investment do far better. There is better in Scandinavia and Germany and the Netherlands and South Korea. So when people tell you that the Scandinavian countries can afford a generous welfare state because they are rich, correct them by explaining that Scandinavian countries are rich because they have a generous welfare state. Yet for some reason we look at America, who is worse, and think we should emulate them. For some reason, our government is advocating more austerity on top of the last 10 years. For some reason, we haven't learned what matters, and we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes at the cost of the poor. This is particularly important now, as the Conservatives again bring up the spectre of austerity as though it is not just necessary, but right for bringing us out of the aftermath of COVID. Yet it is not just unnecessary, but completely, utterly, terrifyingly wrong. The Tories are prescribing arsenic to a beleaguered, belaboured country. We have to stand up to this and ask for politicians to be economically numerate and socially literate, for politicians able to look at the wealth of data on the harm of austerity, and to rebuild this country for a new golden age founded on the strength of a welfare state. Next time, we will look at another of the myths that has led to the austerity and the cutting of the welfare state: welfare dependency.